Currently, one of the top posts of all time in r/Mac gaming is this. Strangely, the user seems to think that PCs will have a hard time getting support for Grand Theft Auto 6, but the real point of the image is at the bottom, where good ol' Macintosh lies. In the comments, user Glitch replies, "We don't buy Macs to play games. We just force them to play games. Seeing what can run is kind of a game in itself." If you're watching this channel, you're probably into gaming. And if you're into gaming, you're probably watching this on Windows. For over 25 years, Windows has been the de facto operating system for video games. Like that Redditor said, no one buys a Mac to game. But they used to. Believe it or not, Apple computers had a thriving game dev scene. Apple used to be an essential platform for video games. So what happened?
We're still islands.
I wanted the needs of the average person to be more important than those of the big businesses, the government, the military.
Everything around you that you call life was made up by people that were no smarter than you.
Hey, has anyone seen a Patreon? Oh, there it is. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak founded Apple in 1976 to release the appropriately named Apple I. This would be followed up exactly 1 year later with the Apple II. Their first model was more a proof of concept, a hobby project. The II was a full-fledged machine, and it looked good. With a color display and power to boot, it became popular with home users for its visuals and price point. It was also designed primarily by Steve Wozniak, and he wanted it to be a gaming machine. Wozniak loved video games. During Jobs' short stint at Atari, he got an order to make the game eventually known as Breakout, and he called Woz to design and optimize it. Woz actually got screwed over here. Jobs never told him about or shared the thousands of dollars he got in bonuses, and he didn't even care because he had such a good time making the game.
One of the 3 F's, food. The second F is fun. They're just things that make you feel good. And the other is friends, because you can joke with friends. That's also humor. So the 3 F's, and when I told that story to our high school, when they put me in the Hall of Fame at the high school, the kids started laughing. And I said, there might be a 4th F.
Not only were the graphics great for gaming, the system came bundled with 2 paddle controllers and support for Integer Basic, the language he'd written Breakout in. Quote, "It was the most satisfying day of my life when I demonstrated Breakout, totally written in Basic. It seemed like a huge step to me. After designing hardware arcade games, I knew that being able to program them in BASIC was going to change the world." Early enthusiasts took note of the system's potential for games. By 1978, just a year after launch, the Apple II was home to a growing library. Adventureland was the first title by Scott Adams, a prolific designer of early text adventures. Beneath Apple Manor is a roguelike that predates Rogue itself by a few months. Maze Game randomly generates a unique layout for the player to escape through a very experimental first-person perspective. 3 Mile Island is a simulation game about trying to prevent an inevitable nuclear meltdown based on the actual 3 Mile Island nuclear meltdown, which happened the same year.
Cool.
Of course, you have to mention Wizardry Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord, released in 1981. This first-person party-based dungeon crawler established many of the genre conventions we know today. While relatively obscure in the West now, it became hugely popular in Japan, and was the direct inspiration for the first Japanese RPGs, like Dragon Quest. Wizardry, along with Ultima, are historical pillars of the RPG genre. There was a clear desire from both developers and users for gaming experiences on the Apple II, which would only be bolstered by the subsequent upgraded models with even better visuals and hardware. Castle Wolfenstein was an Apple exclusive in '81, not only one of the first stealth games, but also the inspiration for id's Wolfenstein 3D, the kickoff to the FPS genre as we know it. The id guys were big fans of Apple, There's an incredible story about a 14-year-old John Carmack breaking into his school with homemade thermite just to steal an Apple II. While Wozniak was busy iterating on his baby, there was another project at Apple. An employee named Jeff Raskin began development on a new low-cost computer. Not only would it be cheap, it would be easier to use than ever before. The engineers at Xerox had created their own operating system, only used internally. It was the first to break free from the text-based input of every other computer and embrace a fully graphical user interface. This also meant the invention of the computer mouse, another peripheral that's become a standard. Apple wanted to take this concept to market. Apple went public in 1980 to a massive $100 million evaluation in 80s money. Well, kind of 70s money, but you get the point. They were rolling in it. That is, maybe 5 or 6 people were. Most of the stock was owned by the founders, and Wozniak felt terribly guilty about it. He gave away $10 million worth of shares, split across almost everyone he could find at the company who held none, and he still had enough to buy a movie theater and a private plane. I mean, with all that money, what else are you gonna do besides rich people hobbies, like flying? Well, maybe he should have had more lessons, because on February 7th, 1981, Wozniak crashed his plane in Scotts Valley, California, moments after takeoff. While no one died, Wozniak suffered a head injury that inflicted him with anterograde amnesia, which prevents the brain from making new memories. He couldn't remember his own name, much less what he was doing, and it took several months for him to regain all his mental faculties. During this time, he was obviously unable to do his job at Apple, but he spent his days eating snacks and playing games on a big Apple II they wheeled in for him. A lot of these details are out of his autobiography, I Was, and I'm going to mention this because I won't ever be able to again. Steve Wozniak's marriage right before this incident was failing, and his wife was spending a lot of time away at Freemason meetings. So, to save his marriage, he joined the Freemasons? And the way he talks about it in the book is like, yeah, they make you say a bunch of weird stuff to get in. I wasn't really down with it, but hey, anything to save the marriage, am I right? And then they still got divorced. Anyway, he took life pretty slowly, even after his memory started functioning again, and decided to take a step away from Apple, instead going back to college and becoming a concert promoter. In his absence, Jobs became a leading force at the company, spearheading the development of the first Macintosh computer, while the Lisa released in 1983. The Macintosh 128K hit store shelves in 1984, and it would have an altogether different relationship with games, one that reflected a different sort of vision. Early feedback from industry analysts had some critiques. The graphical interface was sneered at by some for being too toy-like. They accused it of dumbing down computers for the masses, and that it wasn't a device for serious work. This sent the marketing team and leadership into a panic. A small game called Puzzle had been written as a bit of pack-in software by a programmer named Andy Hertzfeld. His boss told him to cut the game. They were clamping down on bloat in the OS, and a fun time waster was the first thing on the chopping block. Can't have people thinking this is a gaming machine, after all. Hertzfeld fought for its inclusion and eventually optimized it down to 600 bytes. Puzzle shipped with the Macintosh, but this enmity for games wouldn't go anywhere. Another developer, Steve Capps, had written a game he called Alice. It was an action-packed, real-time chess game starring the characters of Alice in Wonderland, and it was a hit in the office. When Jobs found out about it, his first question was, why is he on the Lisa team, his rival project? Capps rewrote the game for Macintosh, and Jobs promised him that Apple would publish it with deluxe treatment. Indeed, the renamed Through the Looking Glass would release in 1984, a few months after the computer, with some of the most lavish packaging I've ever seen. A cardboard box with cloth cover and a ribbon binding, the art a print of a woodcut design that even included a hidden Dead Kennedys logo, Cap's favorite band, the interior cover, a piece of beautiful digital art. Each pixel you can make out is like a brushstroke, an old-timey font to give the appearance of handwritten calligraphy. I'm only showing images I could find online here because this thing is rare and expensive. I'd kill to own one someday. It's the most gorgeous packaging I've ever seen for a video game. It also sold very, very poorly. According to Hertzfeld, Apple's fear of tarnishing their image dashed any hopes of marketing a mere game. I can't imagine the low sales of the Macintosh helped either. Yes, the Macintosh, the subject of one of the most legendary ads of all time, was actually considered a failure on the market. A low price meant low specs. It didn't even have color, which turned off many, especially game developers. Jobs wasn't a businessman, so a year earlier, in 1983, he and Wozniak hired the former CEO of PepsiCo to head the company. John Scully had a very different plan for Apple. Where Jobs was willing to take the loss on the chin and keep competing with IBM, Scully wanted to veer into a less established market: education, small business, and at-home use. Wozniak was actually back at Apple briefly in '84, but not for long. The Apple II was still immensely popular, making up 85% of their sales, but Scully and the board seemed uninterested in it. When leadership met in 1985, they didn't even mention the Apple II or its team. Many sources claim that this was the final straw for Woz, but he maintains to this day that he left because he was interested in other ventures, namely making the first universal TV remote. Even if he left on good terms, he still details the ways in which the Apple II division was given second-rate service compared to the Macintosh. This was a clear move by leadership away from his vision for the company. There was much internal strife between Jobs and Scully. Each plotted literal coups against the other, only for Jobs to be found out, and his resignation soon followed. Apple had lost its two shining stars: Wozniak, the loving tinkerer, and Jobs, the ruthless innovator. With John Scully at the helm, the company entered a new, confused era. The original Macintosh was a weird time for game devs. Many were still loyal to the company, and lots of Apple IIs remained in circulation. There are a couple notable games released in this period. A Mind Forever Voyaging was a text adventure released on multiple systems, including both Mac and Apple II. It's most notable for its biting critique of Ronald Reagan's policies. The player takes the role of a sentient computer in the year 2031, tasked with running a simulation of the fictional president's policy. Naturally, every simulation sees the country fall to ruin. Deja Vu is another cool text adventure from '85, starring a detective in 1940 Chicago who's been framed for murder after losing his memories. Another game with strong political themes, Balance of Power, is by Chris Crawford. It's a bit of a predecessor to his later title, Balance of the Planet, and I think it's a great blend of many ideas from across his career. Strategy management games that go beyond the military and force you to contend with real-world issues. The player must engage in high-stakes negotiation, where backing down loses you prestige, but being too aggressive will end the human race as we know it. If you're curious about Chris Crawford, who's a fascinating developer, go check out my video on him from a few years ago. In terms of graphical showcases, The Colony is also from 1988, but features fully navigable 3D wireframe environments. It's not true 3D polygonal rendering, closer to the smoke and mirrors of the Doom or Build engines, but it predates them by years. This footage is from the game running in color, which was only possible thanks to the upgraded Macintosh 2 from '87. The iPhone came out when I was 5 years old, so I've only ever lived in a world where Apple was cool. But if you're my age, you might not realize that there was a good 12 years or so where they sucked. Seriously, from the late 80s to the late 90s, Apple was a directionless company. Remember how Scully wanted to pivot on areas like education and home use? Well, apparently home use didn't include the roaring success of the Apple II, which they completely ignored starting in 1990. He was really into the idea of miniature handheld computers like the Macintosh Portable, which was portable in the same way that an elephant is portable. Technically. The Newton was another small device, billed as a personal digital assistant. PDAs were like smartphones without the phone part, but they might have been a little premature. Their intended market was professionals, an all-in-one replacement for the contents of their briefcases. Unfortunately, the software itself was lacking, buggy, and its most touted feature of handwriting recognition was shoddy at best, quickly becoming a point of infamy.
Hey, Dolph, take a memo on your Newton. Beat up Martin. Bah!
Needless to say, Apple was floundering about, and you can imagine that low sales didn't make game developers excited about the platform. But there were things happening. Steve Jobs immediately founded his own company, Next. Launched in 1990, the first Next PC was, in many ways, a continuation of his goals with the Macintosh, an easy-to-use, clean-looking graphical operating system, this time with some serious horsepower. This was Next's greatest strength and weakness. A fresh company didn't have the capital saved up to sell something like this at a loss. Next PCs were lauded for their power, but it came at a price. A very literal price. These things were expensive. The first workstation launched at $9,999. Oh, what? That's 1990s money. Well, if we adjust for inflation, these days that would be good lord. While this Apple successor was out of reach for most hands, Next did catch the eye of one John Carmack, legendary super genius, human computer, jujitsu black belt, rocket scientist for fun, John Carmack.
I thought I explained the tapping a little bit more clearly.
He was done stealing Apple IIs. Now he had enough Commander Keen and Wolfenstein money to buy a fleet of Next machines. He adored working on them, and was so enthusiastic he reached out to Steve Jobs himself to ask about a developed on Next logo at Doom's startup. That never happened, but this first meeting with Jobs, if only over email, would be critical for Mac gaming. 1993 also saw the release of Myst, a game I've talked about extensively. Originally developed on Macintosh, the fact it released exclusively on the platform was a big deal. There was a marketing swell around Myst like no other, touted as the game that would finally prove games could be art, embraced by the non-nerd, casual user. Pretty quaint in retrospect, but the hype for a funky little puzzle game was real back then. And we can't talk about 90s Mac gaming without Bungie. They were the Mac devs of their day, and for good reason. They first gained serious notoriety with their 1993 title, Pathways into Darkness. This was a direct answer to Wolfenstein 3D, but with much more extensive RPG systems. Pathways into Darkness was also a showcase of one of Bungie's hallmarks, accessible games with real attempts at storytelling. They expanded on the shooter genre with Marathon. This sci-fi FPS dropped the player onto the titular colony ship and tasked them with stopping an alien invasion. While the story up front was presented on a need-to-know basis, the game was replete with lore and background information accessible on various terminals scattered throughout the station. Players adored this combination of solid gameplay and a deep world to sink their teeth into, and the series spawned 2 sequels. And this all pretty much happened under Apple's nose, with no attention paid. I think this article really illustrates Apple's disinterest in the market as a whole. It recounts the fall 1990 conference of the Software Publishers Association. This brought together tons of big players in the computer world, including several game companies like Nintendo and Konami. One of the IBM execs is quoted saying things like, "We didn't think so many people were willing to shell out an extra $500 for color and sound, and we can't keep the joystick peripheral on the shelves." This was a time when keyboards were big and clunky, and a lot of PC devs didn't know how to make a comfortable control scheme. Joysticks were considered a common, even expected, add-on if you wanted to play games. At this conference, Apple unveiled 3 new machines. The Mac Classic, which had a black and white display and no included hard disk, and 2 other overpriced models doomed to fail. Not very enticing. And hey, are any of these joystick compatible? I quote, "No. Then people will think this is a game machine." What better anecdote to sum up Apple's attitudes towards gaming, and the company in general, at this time? An obsession with keeping up a brand image to their detriment, while simultaneously shirking a potentially lucrative market. In 1997, Bungie started development on Halo. The game had a notoriously rocky ride to the finish line, going through 3 totally different concepts over the course of its 5-year dev cycle, which was really long back then. At one point, they were running out of cash, and who else bailed them out but Microsoft? Of course, they'd complete Halo, and it would emerge as a launch title for the Xbox in 2001. In 1995, when Doom was on more PCs than Windows, Bill Gates considered buying id. When Marathon was the biggest competitor to Doom on Mac, Apple ignored them. And then Microsoft bought them anyway and made their game the mascot of their whole console. What a total fumble on Apple's part. Imagine a world where they scooped up Bungie, and Halo was synonymous with the Apple console, or whatever they'd call it. But they never made a console. Hang on. Wait, what is that? What is that? Okay, I swear to God, you better not be messing with me. No, not an inch closer. Not an inch closer till you tell me what that is. Until you... No. I don't think there would... No. Dude, please. Stop. No. Oh my God, I forgot about the Pippin. I can't believe I get to talk about this stupid thing. I'm so excited. In 1993, Bandai approached Apple with a proposal. They wanted to make what was essentially a small gaming PC running macOS. This was a follow-up to a previous unsuccessful console they tried to launch in Japan called the Pladia, which is a whole other story. Apple liked it enough to develop the technology, but the actual arrangement was pretty strange, despite the fact that this console, the Pippin, was ostensibly a new Macintosh. Apple wouldn't pay for any of the manufacturing or marketing. Instead, that responsibility would be pushed onto various hardware makers whom they'd license the Pippin's technology to. It was like the idea of IBM clones. Multiple manufacturers could make their own Pippins, but on their own dime and with their own spin, I guess. And of course, Apple would get some kickback from the licensing. It's certainly a unique idea, but doomed to fail. For one, this was a gaming device first and foremost, but it was marketed like a console. One of the benefits of console game dev is that every model has the same specs. Sure, there are occasional upgraded models released, but that just raises the ceiling on what studios can do, rather than raising the floor. As I understand it, there were no standardized specs for the Pippin. It had no dedicated graphics or sound processors, meaning that the manufacturer would decide that on their own. Any developer would need to plan for a total lemon and a high-powered rig. Now, these are challenges endemic to PC development. But it's not like anyone likes that. Apple's closed-off ecosystem and the low modularity of computers at the time at least meant that Bungie could plan around the specs of a given Mac model. Marathon 2 did launch on the Pippin, but that was more a product of being a Mac game anyway. All this stuff about different manufacturers making totally different SKUs is all conjecture, because this thing failed hard. Bandai footed the bill on the first 2 models, the Atmark in Japan and Atworld overseas, mostly to get their foot in the door. Some analysts put it as making as little as 20% of their projected sales. Woof. The only thing the Pippin really had going for it was its built-in modem. If we're cool with calling it a console, this would make it the first to have internet connectivity out of the box. Maybe second if you want to count the Genesis's Sega channel. Anyway, sales were so low that they shipped their remaining stock from the US back to Japan, and now it goes for way too much on eBay. I also would love to own one of these. Apple was doing so poorly by this time that they started looking elsewhere, as in Next. Next had it all. The power, the OS, the sensibilities people liked about the old Apple. All the tech is there, it's just too expensive. So, what if we just bought Next? In 1997, Apple acquired the company and installed Jobs as CEO. There wasn't a single wasted second. He took an axe to the company, hacking off every part he thought sucked. This included the Pippin. His next order of business was to integrate Next's OS, Next Step, into the company. Most people don't realize this, but if you're on a Mac today, you're using what is essentially a modern version of Next Step more than the classic Mac OS. With Jobs back in the driver's seat, Apple had a bright future ahead. But there were new hurdles for gaming. So, Steve Jobs hated video games. Among the many projects he canceled when he returned to power was Game Sprockets, a set of APIs being designed specifically for gaming on macOS, and in their place, well, nothing. It's not clear why he despised gaming so much. Maybe he didn't get it, maybe he thought it was a waste of time. I don't know, maybe it had something to do with Nolan Bushnell. But we do know it was real. Bob Iger once recounted a meeting with Jobs about Disney acquiring Marvel. Quote, he claimed to have never read a comic book in his life. I hate them more than I hate video games. I can imagine this put an awkward strain on his relationship with John Carmack. As the latter said in a blog post recounting their relationship, at his core, Steve didn't think very highly of games, and always wished they weren't as important to his platforms as they turned out to be. I never took it personally. I was brought in to talk about the needs of games in general, but I made it my mission to get Apple to adopt OpenGL as their 3D graphics API. I had a lot of arguments with Steve. Part of his method, at least with me, was to deride contemporary options and dare me to tell him differently. They might be pragmatic, but they couldn't actually be good. Quote, I have Pixar. We will make something, an API, that's actually good. It was often frustrating because he could talk with complete confidence about things he was just plain wrong about, like the price of memory for video cards and the amount of system bandwidth exploitable by the Altivec extensions. But when I knew what I was talking about, I would stand my ground against anyone. In the end, Carmack won out, and the first modern macOS would support OpenGL. In his own words, I consider this one of the biggest indirect impacts on the industry that I have had. Make no mistake, OpenGL kept Mac gaming alive for another 10 years. This conversation probably happened in 1997, the same year that Quake 2 came out. A year later was Unreal. The industry was clearly moving towards full 3D. But, as Carmack points out, the fact that this was Apple's standard at the time had huge ripple effects when they decided to get into the phone business. Because they were the biggest game in town, they set the standard, and the fact that they had a non-proprietary API laid fertile ground for development. But let's put a pin in that, because now we're getting into the 2000s, and there were some other tectonic shifts happening. Hey, you guys heard of Valve? They made this little game called Half-Life. Well, if you wanted to play Half-Life 2, the second game to win a BAFTA after... Wait, Call of Duty? Really? Huh. Anyway, you needed a Steam account. Steam was revolutionary for PC gaming. Gone were the days of dropping $60 on a new game only to go home and find out that there was some arcane hardware-software aneurysm that customer support couldn't help you with. You could just download and click play. not to mention its growing collection of titles centralized PC gamers around an easy-to-use storefront and digital library. You might not remember that Steam didn't even exist on Mac until 2010. In a 2007 interview with Kikizo, Gabe Newell was asked about this lack of support. We have this pattern with Apple, where we meet with them, people there go, wow, gaming is incredibly important. We should do something with gaming. And then we'll say, okay, here are 3 things you could do to make that better. And then they say, okay, and then we never see them again. And then a year later, a new group of people show up, who apparently have no idea that the last group of people were there, and never follow through on anything. So they seem to think that they want to do gaming, but there's never any follow through on any of the things that they say they're going to do. I just don't think they've ever taken gaming seriously. We'd love it if they would, but they never have, and can't even follow through on any of their commitments for game developers. It seems bizarre to me, because it's like one of the biggest things holding them back in the consumer space. If you look at a Macintosh right now, it does a lot of things really well compared to a Vista PC. But there are no games. The fact that Mac had such a late start on getting a good digital storefront meant it had to play a lot of catch-up. At this point, there was such a heavy Windows bias in game development that the biggest hurdle to Mac gaming became compatibility. The years upon years of neglect for the market had added up, and most games just couldn't run on Mac. And to be quite honest, one of their best bets for digging themselves out of that hole was Valve. The bottom line is that Valve has a financial, and if we're being nice, philosophical incentive to support Mac gaming. More games compatible on more systems means more Steam installs, which means more revenue. So a few years after this interview, when their relationship with Apple started to turn up, things were looking bright. In 2010, Valve announced that Steam was coming to Mac, and along with it, every one of their own games. This had a weird knock-on effect where Apple earbuds became integral to the TF2 economy, but that's a story for another time. Now, most compatibility was still on the publishers/developers of the respective games, but just getting Steam was a big deal. Much of the next few years lies in the NDA Bermuda Triangle, but there's a certain amount of info we can glean from leaks, announcements, and the behavior of both companies. Steve Jobs was forcibly removed from CEO in 2011 because he died trying to treat cancer with apples. Maybe one of the more ironic deaths of all time. He was succeeded by Tim Cook, who's remained in the position ever since. Cook's leadership style has been criticized for being less innovative than Jobs, but he generally keeps the line high and maintains Apple's brand image. In 2014, Apple launched Metal, their own proprietary 3D API, meant to be a counterpart to Microsoft's Direct3D and DirectX software. I've used the term API a few times now. For anyone who doesn't know, API stands for Application Programming Interface. It's basically a piece of software that connects a bunch of other pieces of software and lets them work together. Obviously, it gets a lot more complicated than that. We're talking about APIs that make 3D graphics work on your computer. A lot of those compatibility issues go back to this. D3D and DirectX were exclusive to Microsoft. OpenGL wasn't. Metal was exclusive to Apple. Wouldn't it be nice if there was just one API that worked across all these different platforms? Because OpenGL's getting a little old at this point. Enter Vulkan, a non-proprietary 3D API released in 2016 by Kronos Group, a non-profit consortium of developers. What's more, it was originally touted as a successor to OpenGL. This was just what the industry needed. Remember, everyone collating on one company is never a good thing, he says on youtube.com. It was also great for Valve, who had been working on a project to solve compatibility between platforms for years. This goes back to Windows 8, when Microsoft started trying to get people on their own proprietary software and all that. Valve doesn't like playing by other people's rules, and they saw the writing on the wall, so they made a decisive pivot to support Linux gaming, which has historically struggled with compatibility. The end result of this was Proton, a so-called compatibility layer that translates software built for one platform over to another. It was announced in 2018, offering support for Linux and Mac. You might know Proton as that thing that makes your Steam Deck work, but most people forget that it was originally going to make Windows games playable on macOS. So what happened? Later that year, Apple announced they were dropping support for OpenGL, which made sense. It was pretty deprecated at that point. So naturally, they were adopting Vulkan, right? Right? They really do it to themselves, don't they? Again, NDA Bermuda Triangle, but it looks like this move really alienated Valve. Mac support was quietly dropped from Proton before release, and a supposed VR project between both companies seems to have fallen through, resulting in the Valve Index and Apple Vision Pro. It's hard to overstate how bad this move was for Mac gaming. Valve's Steam Deck, released 2022, runs a version of Linux called SteamOS. And because it's so successful, there is now an army of lifelong Windows gamers asking for Deck support, which is really Linux support. They created the proverbial carrot on a stick to solve one of the biggest hurdles to Linux adoption: game compatibility. Imagine if every game on Steam Deck could also be played on macOS with little to no issue on an actual Apple desktop. No emulators, no virtual machines, no $100 software. What if it just worked? 2018 was also the year Molten VK launched. This was a compatibility layer by Kronos Group themselves to make Vulkan work on macOS, but it was too little too late. In 2019, Apple introduced their new ARM64 processors. This is another compatibility thing, but to give a quick rundown, x86 to 64 is a type of system infrastructure that's been the most popular historically for desktop computers. Most Windows and Linux PCs run on it, and programs need to be written specifically for it. This encompasses both 32-bit and 64-bit applications. ARM is an alternative infrastructure that offers efficiency over control, and programs also need to be written for it explicitly as well. This means that natively, a huge amount of software stopped being compatible with Mac computers. To alleviate this, Apple introduced Rosetta, another translation layer between x64 and ARM programs. You'll notice I didn't say x86 because they didn't bother including older 32-bit software in Rosetta. Unless you're designing for mobile, most game developers aren't used to working with ARM, and the already small gaming audience on Mac just doesn't justify it for many of them. They just completely stopped caring about gaming. Every one of these decisions was disastrous for support. Now, you may be asking, Tigan, what about mobile gaming? And that's a great question. I'd know, because I wrote it. So let's take that pin out. Okay, let's get down to brass tacks, because I'm getting kinda tired of writing this script. If they care so little about gaming, why is the iPhone so big for gaming? As I see it, there's 4 key factors which all compound each other. Number 1 is first mover advantage. Apple was the first manufacturer to have what we now call a modern smartphone. No keyboard, all touch. And beginning with the second generation, the 3G, it came bundled with the App Store. The App Store was many people's first introduction to a concept of the sort, an easily browsable digital software catalog where a huge variety of apps could be downloaded at the press of a button. No fear of wrong specs or compatibility. Number 2 is the massive install base. This is the same benefit that their desktops have, which they've never put in the effort to exploit. The thing is, they never really had to on iPhone because of number 3. The phone is a perfect medium for the kinds of games on offer. It's a casual device, often used in time-wasting spaces like breaks, transport, lying in bed, etc. At a time when the industry was writhing through an extinction-level event with the move to HD development, expectations for mobile games were low. Yeah, it's a game I play for 5 minutes on my phone. I don't care that it's simple and has 2D graphics. Which leads directly to number 4, a fresh, friendly development sector. Many App Store games were such small projects that developers were comfortable charging next to nothing for them, and the 99-cent price tag became synonymous with the platform. It was a low-risk, low-investment space with no big players yet. Mobile games occupy a radically different place in our lives. Consoles are devices first and foremost for game playing. If you want casual browsing and basic functions like email, some software, some gaming, etc., get a laptop. My PC was built with gaming and editing in mind. If you're building your own PC, it's likely for the same reasons. Besides the editing, I guess. A phone is something pretty much everyone gets. An all-in-one device that's embedded itself into modern living. The fact it can play games is just a bonus component. It's like if smartphones didn't exist and your wristwatch could play games, you'd be like, oh yeah, I guess I'll check those out in bed. Put all of these together and you get excited hobbyist programmers, startups, and a few big names pouring into a brand new platform like it's the gold rush. Phones became more important in our lives, and because a lot of people own iPhones, they use the App Store, and they like games, so they play them on their phones. And now they occupy a little slice of our lives that PC or console games don't. Without even really doing anything besides making more powerful new models, Apple just sorta ended up with a big gaming audience on iOS. I think Apple likes the App Store because it's theirs. They control what goes on, they take a cut of every purchase, no need to deal with other companies like Steam or GOG. This is why they don't feel the need to compete with other storefronts. You aren't installing the Play Store or any other app store on an Apple device. As long as you're kept in the walled garden of the Apple ecosystem, it'll support itself. And that's basically Apple's modus operandi today. If it comes to us, cool, but whatever. In 2025, Apple released version 3 of their game porting toolkit. On the surface, this sounds like a compatibility layer, much like Proton, and it sorta is, but it's not the cure-all many Apple heads think it is. The GPTK isn't meant for end users. You will not be using it. It's for developers who are thinking of porting their games to Mac to use in testing, so they can see how well their game might run on a Mac. Okay. Sure. When I first started researching this video, I thought that surely there'd be some great catastrophe that doomed Mac gaming. Something had to have gone horribly wrong to throw them off course after the success of the Apple II. What I found was that nothing happened. That's actually the problem. Nothing happened. The reason Mac gaming barely exists today is because Apple themselves have neglected it. They don't care. It comes down to a pattern of behavior. Ignoring the Apple II and losing Wozniak, ignoring PC gaming during its most fertile decade, leaning into proprietary software, and alienating companies like Valve. It's such an afterthought that one of the biggest games of the decade, Cyberpunk 2077, didn't hit Mac until this year, 5 years after launch. So what can they do to remedy this, if they have any interest in doing so? At this point, looking at the history, I think it's obvious. You can find video after video on YouTube of people benchmarking Macs to prove that power isn't the problem. If they want to break with so many other standards, they need compatibility layers to make games easy to play. Molten VK is a step in the right direction, but that's not Apple, and as far as anyone can tell, they have no intention of working with Kronos. The ARM thing is also a big problem. Keeping Rosetta around would be cool. That would help. And you know, this is a personal thing, but the mouse, the keyboard, I just don't want to play video games on that thing, man. The biggest thing holding them back is a total refusal to put in the elbow grease to develop software and hardware for the gaming market. Imagine a line of gaming-focused Macs with strong GPUs and the lightning-fast efficiency of the M-series chips. It could have all the under-the-hood software to make thousands and thousands of games easy to play, just like Proton on the Steam Deck. Wouldn't that be so cool? Some kind of dedicated device like that. Something like, the Pippin 2? Thank you to my patrons who keep this channel free. $10 a month patrons get access to exclusive commentary tracks for these videos. You can also support me on Ko-fi and listen to my podcast. Bye.
Here comes a daredevil!
Wasn't laughing under the circumstances. I've been shockingly nice.
Game over!